Welcome back. In our introductory session, we started to talk about pivot tables. We will start this session with, you've guessed it, pivot tables. Now, as we progress in our knowledge, we also have to narrow the scope of our topics a little bit so we can spend more time to really understand what it is that we are looking at. Along with pivot tables, we will also be covering formula-driven conditional formatting, timelines, which is similar to slicers, logic statements, and lookups. We're going to use data validation to create drop-down lists, and we're also going to create dynamic charts or pivot charts. First things first, let's create a new pivot table. Here we have a sheet called data with our placeholder data that has been converted into a table and is called table earnings. On the Insert tab in the top left, we have our pivot table options. If you don't know what type of data you want to leverage in creating your table, you always have the option to click on the Recommended Pivot Tables button. This will open a pop-up with a few template options. In our case, we're going to click into a cell, and I'm simply going to click the upper portion of my standard pivot table button. This will immediately identify our table name. Again, just like in our beginner example, we can choose to insert our pivot table into a new workbook. At the bottom, however, you will see the add this to the data model. What does this mean? Well, you'll have to stay tuned for the follow-up advanced workshop to find out. So in this case, I'm simply going to press OK. This will open our new sheet called Sheet 1 and will bring us back to our default pivot table view, which of course we can customize. Now from the cog icon, we can click the drop down and choose a different layout, very much the way that we can using Litera Compare. In this case, I will go with option 2, Field section and area section side by side. Now it will be a lot easier to click and drag my fields where I want them. Now while we're at it, from the same cog dropdown, if we had a larger number of fields, we do have additional sort options we can use. In this case, I'll choose A to Z. Okay, great. Let's create some reports. Now, as you've probably already guessed, filters are used to include or exclude data from the table. Columns are going to group data across the top of the table, creating headings for comparison. Rows organize data vertically by defining the categories as they appear as row labels, and values holds the actual data to be summarized, like your totals, averages, counts, so on and so forth. Now, let's say I want to create a report that will let me filter total earnings by individual practice group for the clients. If that is the case, I'm going to drag my client names field into rows. I'm going to place total in Canadian dollars into the value. That is, of course, the dollar amount that we are interested in and the thing that we are calculating. I'll add the practice group to our filters, as just mentioned. And now from the dropdown, I can select exactly which practice group I would like to target. It will show the corresponding clients that belong to the set group, and as well, it will display both of their individual totals as well as the group total. One quick note, don't forget that if you don't want to use sum, you can click on the drop down for your field, select value field settings, and choose how your data is going to be represented. As you can see, we have count, we have average, max, min, product, so on and so forth. You can also change the formatting by clicking on number format in the bottom left. Of course, you can adjust your decimal places. You can adjust the symbol if you're not dealing with dollars, if you're dealing with euros or any other currency type. When you're happy with your changes, press OK, and you're good to go. Now, if you want to clean up your data a little bit before you move on, one thing we can do is we can right-click on our earnings, and we can go to Sort and choose from largest to smallest. Now, as we just saw, I can click on the practice group filter and see reports for each practice group, but that can be too time consuming. Instead, another thing that we can do is click on the options dropdown in our pivot table document group, and we're going to select Show Report Filter Pages. This will bring up anything we have in our filters. We only have practice group, so we can select it and press OK. Now, what did this actually do? If we look at our sheets at the bottom, you will see that we have a new sheet for each practice group. And as another quick tip, if you right-click on the arrows in the bottom left, it's going to bring up a list with a view of all of your sheets. Double-click on the one in question. In this case, I will choose litigation, and it's going to take you straight there. Now, as a further tip, if you double-click on any of the numbers, you will get a details sheet created for that reference. So there is our new sheet called the Details 1, and it's going to target just that instance for Halcyon and Co. So in this case, I don't need this sheet. I'm simply going to delete it really quick. There we go. Now going back to my sheet 1, if you recall in our beginner series, we did introduce adding data bars. This time, let's create our own rule. Again, from the Home tab, under Conditional Formatting, Data Bars, at the very bottom there, we're going to have more rules. That is precisely what we're going to choose. Now, instead of selected cells, which is really just before, what we're going to change is all cells showing in our sum of total in CAD values. There we go. This will make our actions dynamic and, of course, snap to the size of our pivot table. At the bottom, you can click the checkbox if you only want to show the bar and not the number. Change your color and then click OK. In this case, I will select to disable the numbers. So I will show the bar only. And I will change the color to that orange that I used in the original beginner workshop as well. And I'm going to click OK. Now in the title column, I'm going to click in there and I'm just going to delete that text and put in a space, and you'll see exactly why in just a second. So we've left that blank. What could the reason for that be? Well, because we've changed the name of this new data, if you will, what we can do is we can drag our total in CAD and put it back into our values. But something really interesting has happened here. One thing to remember is when we refresh our data, our columns will collapse. Pivot tables by default are set to auto resize. However, we can turn this off by again going to our pivot table analyze. We can go to our options dropdown, options again, and at the very bottom of our layout and format, we can uncheck auto fit column width on update and press OK. Now we can size our columns to whatever size we like, and we don't have to worry about them rubber banding or snapping back to an automated measurement. Now, as an extra tip, if you don't want to see your grand totals, what can we do about that? Clearly, our grand totals is skewing the view for our data bars a little bit, and we might want to fix that. We're going to right-click on the grand totals. We're going to go to Pivot Table Options. Now, under Totals and Filters, there are our grand totals. So we can turn this off for rows and for columns. In this case, I'm going to turn off the grand totals for columns and press OK. Perfect. This will definitely make our data bars look more natural. But what if we want to introduce our own logic instead? You can use formulas to trigger conditional formatting, which will give you far more flexibility. Let's introduce the if statement, which is a very simple logic formula, but an incredibly powerful one. The syntax for the if statement is as follows. If logic test, then value if true, otherwise value if false. In other words, you give Excel a logic question, and based on the cells or the range or the calculation that you select, if your test happens to be true, you specify what you want Excel to do in the second parameter, which is value if true. If it is false, well, you also let Excel know what to do in that case. Now, what can Excel actually do depending on the outcome of your logic statement? Anything from returning simple text to running additional calculations using different formulas, which is called nesting. We will take a look at an example of this a little bit further into the workshop. Now, for the time being, let's create a custom conditional formatting rule wherein if the dollar value is less than $100,000, we want those cells to be shaded in light purple. So again, I'm going to select all of my monetary values in my pivot table. And again, from the conditional formatting dropdown, this time I'm going to go to the bottom and choose new rule. Since this time we selected our range, then the selected cells above is in fact displaying the correct cells that I would like to be targeted by this rule. Now, the rule type that we're going to choose is, of course, going to be the last one on that list. As you can see, there are plenty of other templates, but what we want to do is use a formula to determine the cells to format. Once we select this option, we will be presented with a field where we can enter our logic statement. Now, following the syntax we just discussed, I'm going to enter our formula. So equals if, open parentheses, just as you would enter the formula in a regular cell, we're going to now select our range, B4 to B23, and then our less than sign, 100,000. There we go. So if we remember the syntax, then we're going to press comma and choose what the outcome will be if this is true. In this case, I will just enter true. And if it is false, I will just enter false. I don't need to perform any other calculations. The only thing I need to enter is true and false in this case, because conditional formatting only cares if something is true. So as a result, that means if anything is less than 100,000, then to these numbers, do this. And what is this? Well, we're going to click on the Format button. We're going to go to our Fill Colors, and we're simply going to choose that light purple. Press OK again, and there you have it. So as we can see, any number that is less than 100,000 is going to now be shaded in light purple. And why might we do that? Well, we're not always going to be sorting our data by the largest to the smallest number. In fact, we might go and sort our clients from A to Z, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to pick out exactly the data that you are interested in. Now, if you ever need to make modifications to your logic, we can always go back to conditional formatting. We can choose manage rules, and there you're going to be able to edit, delete, or readjust the order of your rules. In this case, with my current rule selected, I'm simply going to delete this rule and press OK. Now, since we're building new fields, let's stick with that trend, but this time with the purpose of creating additional calculations. Clicking back on our Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, what we're going to do now is click the Field Items and Set dropdown. And from here, of course, we're going to choose Calculated Field. Now, as you can see, we can perform calculations on any of our existing fields. In this case, I'm going to double click into the Total in CAD field name, that's going to plug that into our formula bar automatically. And the purpose of this is, what if I want to create discounts for these charges? So I will name this field discount. Now, since Excel already did the work for us and populated our total in CAD in the formula field, let's say I want to apply a sweeping 10% discount. So just like we learned in our basics workshop, we can use our asterisk as our multiplication symbol. And in bracket, I'm going to choose 1 minus 0.1, which is going to represent that 10% discount. I'm going to click Add and press OK. Let me expand that column. You can see the discount field has been added into our pivot table fields, and it has automatically gone at the bottom of our values. As a result, it follows our data bars, and we can clearly see our new totals with that extra 10% taken off the total in CAD column. So in this case, I might want to click back into the column name and change this, instead of sum of discount, to sum after discount. Press enter. There's our new title. And again, because our columns don't automatically resize, I can just double click between the column letter and it will snap it accordingly. Now, the next thing we can do is to organize our data further. Let's get rid of the data bars. We no longer need them, so I'm just going to remove that field from our chart. I'm going to keep things simple. Now, we have 20 clients, and we need to further break them down into 4 groups of 5. We can very easily do this by using our Control-Click or Click plus Drag to make our selection. There we go. And we can right click, we can create our group, and now that we have group 1 above, we can simply rename that to whatever we like. In this case, I will just leave them as group, and I will choose the next group of 5, right click, group, there's another group. And finally, our very last group, going to make selecting it much easier. There we have 4 groups, 5 clients each. Now, of course, these groups will also appear in our pivot table fields. This will give you the option to sort, filter, and run calculations on the group alongside the individual entities. So if I unclick client names, for example, we're only going to see the groups 1 through 4 and then their corresponding totals along with, again, the discount. And of course, I can always re-enable them so we can get the complete picture. Now, if you ever need to ungroup, it is as simple as, again, right-clicking and choosing ungroup. Same with the other groups as well. Very easy to right-click and restore your individual client list. Now, the last tip is to add a timeline. In our beginner workshop, we looked at inserting a slicer to act as a dynamic filter we can use to very quickly target subsets of our data. Well, we can do the same with a timeline. Because we have a date column in our data, if we go back to our pivot table analyze ribbon, and right beside the slicer button, you're going to see insert timeline. Now, of course, we only have one field that is date related, so we can choose date build and press OK. Now, of course, we can resize this window. We can reposition it as you just saw, and make it fit however you like. Immediately in the top right-hand corner, you can choose a variety of different breakdowns. We have years, quarters, months, and days. In this case, I'm going to select quarters. And just like with the slicer, I can click on any of the components within the timeline to get the data that is relevant for that segment. So for example, I might choose Q1 and Q2 of 2025. That's going to give me the corresponding data. I can click on just one. I can click and drag to select a wider range. And again, this is going to visually let you break down the data into just the components that you are interested in analyzing. Of course, just like with the slicers, if you click the filter button in the top right, it will restore it back to default and give you the complete picture. Perfect. The next thing we're going to take a look at is logic and lookup functions. So to make a little bit more room in our sheet category, I no longer need the individual breakdown for each one of our practice groups. I'm going to shift select every one of those sheets, right click, delete. Yes, I'm okay with deleting all of those. We will keep the pivot table. I'm simply going to select my lookup plus if tab or sheet, if you will. Now we're not just using the lookup function by itself, but we will in fact use it in combination with the if statement we just learned. You may be familiar with VLOOKUP from older versions of Excel. However, with Excel 365, we have a significantly better version called XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP, much like VLOOKUP, will let you search for a value in one column or row and return a corresponding value from another. However, it comes with some massive quality of life improvements, including searching in any direction. Unlike VLOOKUP, which only searches from top to bottom and retrieves a value from the right, XLOOKUP can search in any direction since you are no longer limited by the col index number parameter. You can now specify a lookup array and return array instead. You'll see this in practice in just a minute. Wildcard matching. XLOOKUP also supports wildcards like the asterisk, which represents any number of characters, and a question mark, which can look for a random character. This is going to make for far more flexible text searches, but the key here is you can turn this off where VLOOKUP automatically considers these characters as wildcards. Multiple return values. This is going to be a big improvement in having the ability to return multiple values at once. Exact match. With XLOOKUP, the default is exact match. This is more of a quality of life change, but an important one. VLOOKUP by default returned approximate match, which of course, if you forgot about, could potentially throw a wrench in your output. Forget about those column index numbers. With XLOOKUP, you don't have to waste your time counting which column you are referencing. It directly references the lookup and return arrays, making it far more dynamic. And finally, graceful missing values. Instead of seeing that horrible NA error where you'd otherwise have to use an if NA formula to set a custom error message, it now comes built into the XLOOKUP function. What does this all mean? Let's find out, and we will start by exploring the syntax. Now we're already in our lookup plus if sheet, and we will see much the same data with a few changes. As you can see in column I have entered a name and matter, cell J23 and J24. I want to use XLOOKUP to search for the name that I will enter in cell J23, and I want it to automatically return its corresponding matter number in cell J24. So let's start by entering the name Aurora Stratton in cell J23. In cell J24, like with any other formula, we're going to begin by typing equals XLOOKUP. Again, it autofills. You can hit the tab button to populate the cell. And let me scroll over so we can see the entire bottom portion, because as you know, the moment you hit tab in Excel, it will immediately below the cell give you all of the parameters you need to enter for the formula to function correctly. As a reminder, if you want a more visual approach to learning the syntax, what did we learn in the beginner video? That's right, we can go to the formulas tab and click that insert functions button right there. So I'm actually going to show you using that method. I'm going to click on Insert Functions. I'm going to move over that pop-up a little bit and type XLOOKUP, press go, see what it gives us. There it is. I'm going to hit the OK button. Perfect. Now we have a user interface that goes beyond just breaking down the syntax for us, but it even tells us what types of values each argument will accept to the right of each equal sign. Now, when typing the formula directly into a cell, everything that is in square brackets is optional, and in this case, every argument that isn't bold is optional. And if that is the case, we need to identify the mandatory arguments, which is our lookup value, our lookup array, and our return array. The lookup value is what we are testing against, which in this case is the client name Aurora Stratton. Just like before, we can click into the cell in question, so our lookup value, and I can simply click into the cell that contains the value that is of interest, J23. Next, we have to identify the lookup array, which means where is this name we are searching for? What column? So as you've guessed, I can click into that lookup array, and in this case, I can either type the number A2 to A21, or I can simply scroll to the left and drag and select that range. As a consequence, and as you've also guessed, the return array is going to be the column that contains the value we are looking for. What is that value? Well, as mentioned, we want the matter number to be returned. So if that is the case, I'm going to click in that return array field. And once again, I'm going to click and drag and select the corresponding range, which is of course C2 to C21. Once I press OK, the correct matter is going to be populated in cell J24. Now this time, let's edit the formula directly in the cell instead of using the visual interface. So as I mentioned, the parameters in the square brackets are optional, but they are rather important in determining how XLOOKUP will return the data you are targeting. Let's test some of them out. We have if NA built into the formula. All we need to do is enter a custom message. Now, pop quiz, how do you get Excel to treat your entry as plain text? You got it. Don't forget to wrap it in quotes. So in this case, what I'm going to enter, if not found, open quote, I'm simply going to type in no match. There we go. Now to move on to match mode, I'm going to hit that comma, and we're going to get a variety of different options. Match mode is very useful. If we use exact match, we are expecting that we will get the correct matter number in this instance because we typed the name Aurora Stratton exactly as we see it in the table. So that is exactly what I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose 0 and I'm going to press enter. Now our formula doesn't break down because again, we have the correct spelling in the name field. However, if I type Elara and press enter, what happens? Of course, we're going to trigger the no match text because there is no client that has the exact name Elara. However, I can modify the match mode to look for approximate values instead. So going back into the formula, if I delete the 0 and instead choose exact match or next largest item, press tab and then press enter to populate it, this time it recognizes that Elara is part of the client name, even if it's not completely identical. However, regardless, it still returns the correct matter number, which is 4655025. What about wildcards? Well, we know the asterisk represents any number of characters. What we can do is enter part of a name followed by the asterisk, or the asterisk first and then end of a name. And using our wildcard match, it will find anything that contains those letters and is followed by any number of other characters. So to demonstrate, again, I'm going to go back in there. I'm going to choose wildcard character match, which is 2. Again, press tab, press enter to initiate. And this time, let's type in Dune asterisk. So we want it to look for Dune and any number of other characters that follow. Once I press enter, it's going to return 8425414. That is the correct number. Finally, we have the order in which the search is performed. With VLOOKUP, you only had the option for searching from top to bottom. With XLOOKUP, you can search from the bottom to the top as well. And you have 2 binary searches that work once you sort your lookup array in either ascending or descending order. So again, clicking back into my formula, if I press comma to go back into our search mode, I'm now going to be able to see that I have the ability to search from first to last, search from last to first. And if I mouse over the binary search, you're going to see perform a binary search that relies on the lookup array being sorted in ascending order. So if you're ever unsure about what any of these options means, mouse over them and you'll get a quick description of what each one is going to do for you. In this case, I'm fine with searching from first to last since we only have unique values, unique customer names in each of our cells. So I will choose 1 and press enter. Nothing is going to change in that regard. But what if I don't want to type in the search criteria every time? Is there an easier way to deal with our lookup values? Yes, and we can use something called data validation. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to modify my formula so that I no longer use an approximate match. So I'm going to click in that number, I'm going to delete it, and I'm just going to change it back to exact match, press enter, fantastic. Now, in cell J23, I don't want to have to type in every single client's name. So I'm just going to delete my manual entries. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to click on the data tab. We have data validation under our data tools. So I can click on that button right there. I'm going to click in the drop down and select list because I want to list all of my clients. Again, ignore blank. In cell dropdown, that's precisely what I'm looking for. And of course, what do I want as my source? Well, I'm going to click in that source field, and then I'm going to select all of the names in my client list. So cell A2 all the way to cell A21. Once I hit OK, you will see that cell J23 now has a dropdown. And I can very easily click into that dropdown, select any of the clients on that list, and our cell J24, because it's sampling J23 for the lookup value, is going to return the proper corresponding matter number because we're doing exact matches only. The next thing we're going to do is talk about nesting formulas to increase the power with which we can crunch our data. Let's presume that I want to apply a discount based on numbers worked. Presumably, the more business a client is giving, the more of a discount I want to offer. How can we do this with XLOOKUP? Well, we need to include some logic into the mix. This is where the if formula comes into play. We already learned the syntax earlier. If something happens, then return this value. If the opposite is true, then return this value instead. So how do we combine these two? I personally always work from the inside out. In other words, first I find the data that I'm looking for, and then I will tell Excel what to do with it if it is presented in a certain way. So if that's true, let's start with XLOOKUP first. Again, we can scroll a little bit to the right just so we can see cell H1, where I am going to type in equals XLOOKUP. Again, autofill, hit tab to populate it into the cell. And this time what we're looking for is cell F2, which is the number of hours billed. That is going to be our lookup value. Now our lookup array is going to be K2 to K8. One very important thing, as we learned in the beginner section, we have to make sure that the values in column K and column L do not move as we fill our data in column H. How do we do that again? Well, we want to convert them to absolute references by selecting their cell range in our formula and hitting the F4 key. Again, that will insert those dollar signs in front of both the column and the row reference, which will lock in the entire cell range into place. So that is our lookup array. Our lookup value, once we hit the comma right there, this is going to be our discount percent. So same exact thing. I'm going to select L2 to L8. I'm going to also create that as an absolute reference, as just mentioned. I'm going to leave if not found blank. I'm going to leave match mode as exact match or next smaller item. I'm going to close my expression and press enter. Now, why did we choose exact match or next smallest number? We chose this because when applying discounts, we don't round up. We have to look down. So for example, if someone worked 89 hours, we fall back down to the next lowest threshold of 2%, even though they are so close, 1 hour off, they just don't get that 5% discount, sadly. So our formula looks about right. We get a return value of 0.09, but we want the actual dollar value. So how do we get that? Well, it's as simple as multiplying it back to G2. Clicking back into our cell, H2 here, I'm going to go back to the end of that formula. I'm going to enter my asterisk and I'm going to click into cell G2 and press enter. So this is where we can go a step further and add some extra logic to this formula. In this case, it's not really necessary because we are already able to run the calculation regardless, but it will help us to illustrate the point perfectly well. So clicking back into cell H1, I'm going to click in front of the equals sign, and I can type if and press tab again. What we're doing now is we're nesting the XLOOKUP function within an if statement. We can see this because it is asking us for our logic test. Let's say that if the number of hours worked is greater than 1, then run our lookup formula. If not, well, return 0. So what is our logic test then? If F2, and I'm going to just type it in this time, is greater than 1, comma, then our value, if true, is to run our entire XLOOKUP function. However, if the time is less than 1 hour, of course, then what happens if that's false, if that actually happens to be the case and we have less than 1 hour worked? We're just going to enter comma and press 0. Just give us 0. We're not going to worry too much about the discount in that case. So just like before, we have to make sure that the expression is complete by inserting that closing parentheses, and then we can press the enter. Now that our formula is complete, how do we autofill? As we learned in the basic session, we can click in the bottom right corner and simply drag across, and we can see all of the numbers. Now, as a pro tip, If remembering absolute references is too cumbersome, what you can use instead is named ranges, which by default are going to assume absolute reference properties. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to select K2 to K8. I'm going to go to the Formulas tab, and here I have the Name Manager under Defined Names document group. I can click on that Name Manager. I can select New. I can call it Hours. That is completely fine because I've selected my range. It is already in the Referred To selection at the bottom of our prompt, and I can simply press OK. There we have it. So we have two names now. Our initial table of data is called Table Earnings, and now we also have another name called Hours. Fantastic. So how does this work? Well, if I go back into my formula, instead of having K2 to K8, I can simply type in hours, press tab, press enter, and if I autofill, nothing changes because it works exactly the same way. Of course, if anything ever outlives its usefulness, or if you need to make changes, you can always go back to the Name Manager, edit, delete, and or otherwise manage all of your named ranges. Finally, let's end on something fun and visual: pivot charts. Now, it is important to outline some key differences between regular charts, as we saw them in the beginner video, versus pivot charts, which is what we're going to look at now. Standard charts are going to reference the data in your worksheet directly, while pivot charts are based directly on the pivot table you are referencing. This leads to another important distinction. Standard charts are static, which means you have to update them manually, but they do let you easily switch which data is being referenced across whatever rows and columns you are including. On the other hand, pivot charts, because they are referencing a pivot table, they too get to retain the dynamic nature of said pivot table, meaning any changes that happen in the pivot table will instantly be reflected in the chart. And yes, you've probably guessed this means slicers and other dynamic elements too will be captured by the chart in real time. In fact, this is one of the core methods of creating the fancy Excel dashboards you may have seen before. Now, as a result, if your data is already clean, compact, and summarized effectively, you may choose to go with a standard chart, as that will give you full control over the look and formatting. On the other hand, if you're working with a massive data set with many moving pieces requiring a pivot table to organize, by that same virtue, a pivot chart may come in handy. Now let's actually create one. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of my sum of discount. Let's keep things simple. I'm just going to remove that field. And what we're going to do, as per usual, we're going to click on our insert. And with my pivot table selected, I'm going to click in the upper portion of my pivot chart button from the charts document group. And in this case, I am going to go down to bar, and I'm going to simply select the basic cluster bar chart. But of course, don't forget there are variances even within the chart types. For example, in this case, we have 3D bar graphs at the very top here. You have different ways of visualizing the data in stacked form, for example. Again, I'm simply going to choose the basic one and press OK. Now, once I press OK, of course, I'll be able to move it around. I'll be able to resize it so we can get a better idea of what it is that is being shown to us. And in this case, just like with the standard charts, I can click on the chart elements in the top right to select additional options. I will choose the second option to have access titles. Fantastic. And once they appear, I can simply double click into them to select the text, and I will rename them clients. And of course, at the bottom here, I'm going to change this one to earnings. But what if I wanted to change how the dollar values display or other values in our chart for that matter? That I can do by right-clicking on the value in question. And what I'm going to choose is Format Axis. Now, on the right side panel, we have all kinds of options to tweak the visual representation of our data however we like. For example, I may wish to increase the maximum value to be displayed, let's say in this case to 500,000, and press enter. This will compress our data a little bit. Further, I may choose to change the units, so the major interval, instead of only 50,000, is now 100,000. Perfect. Now we have a little bit of separation between those numbers. And what if the values were not actually in dollars? If I expand the numbers drop down, there you can see the category is currency. We have 2 decimal places. And from the symbols drop down, I could very easily choose any other type of monetary value. This goes for your tick marks, it goes for your labels. So by all means, feel free to explore and see all that you can do, the various options. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is click on the Styles button. And let's make this chart a little bit more stylish. Because we changed the intervals of the numbers on our horizontal axes to look less busy, I still want to know what the actual figures are. So I will choose our third table option right here, or styling option, if you will, because the values are listed on the bars themselves. And of course, just like with the basic charts or the standard charts, you still have the option to click on the Colors tab and then choose a different color layout for your chart. Perfect. Now, as mentioned before, because this is a pivot chart, you will also see that we have filters built in as drop-downs. So here we have our practice group, and then here we have our client names. We can sort, we can select which ones we're particularly targeting, so on and so forth. But this is also the reason why you don't have the filters button immediately below the styles button, as you would have seen with the standard chart. Again, our pivot chart links directly to our pivot table. So you can think of the pivot table as the primary filter. So in this case, let me go to practice group. I'm going to choose employment or litigation, press OK. There we go. Now, again, our pivot chart is dynamic and it will instantly respond to whatever we do as far as the pivot table is concerned, which also mirrors the practice group which we have chosen, as you can see in the top left. It's only litigation at this time. But just like before, what if I don't want to interact with these drop-downs because they are a little bit cumbersome? No problem. Let me collapse this panel to create a little bit more real estate. I'll even close the pivot table panel as well. And this time I'm going to go back into my insert and I'm going to choose slicers. I want 3. I want client, I want practice group, and I want date build. I'm going to press OK, and I'm simply going to position them at the top right just to make things a little bit more clear and a little bit more organized. And these ones are going to have quite a few additional entries. So I'm going to expand this list so we can see all of the necessary data. Great. Now, everything is dynamic. Everything is responsive. If I go into practice group and I control click 2 of these, employment and litigation, everything in this sheet is going to update from the chart to the pivot tables. And of course, only the relevant data across all 3 of our slicers are going to be displayed. So in employment and litigation, these are the relevant clients, and here are the appropriate dates. And at the very top of every slicer, I have additional options. I can also clear my filters, which, as you can see, the shortcut is Alt-C. That will restore everything to its base. That's going to do it for this workshop. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this information proved useful in giving you additional information to upgrade your existing knowledge on pivot tables, pivot charts, how to use conditional formatting in combination with logic statements, a brief introduction in nesting formulas together and using some of the more common and most powerful formulas in the Excel arsenal, the lookups, the if statements. There are many more, and we're going to cover all of them in due course. So stay tuned for that one. Thank you again very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.